The last train left Iron Hollow, Colorado on October 16th, 1889, and nobody waved goodbye because nobody knew it was the last. The locomotive pulled out of the little wooden station at 3:30 in the afternoon, its whistle rolling across the silver hills like any other Wednesday. Children stopped chasing each other long enough to watch it go. A woman shaking out a tablecloth on her porch raised one hand in the absent way you greet a thing that comes back every 2 weeks without fail. The engineer, a soft-spoken man named Aldous Marin, who had a wife in Denver, and 3 sons under 10, tipped his cap to a small girl in a blue coat, standing beside her mother on the platform. The girl waved back with both hands. 5 days later, Aldous Marin would be dead at the bottom of Ravenmaw Gorge, his body never recovered, and the little girl in the blue coat would be one of the few people in town who remembered his face. Her name was Renly Penrose. She was 7 years old. Her mother's name was Tamsin, and Tamsin Penrose was about to become either the most hated woman in Iron Hollow or the most beloved, depending on how the winter chose to break. The town sat at 2,400 meters in the high silver country south of Leadville, a place where the air thinned the blood and the winters could bury a man's chimney to its cap. There were 437 souls in Iron Hollow that October, counting children, counting the old miners who slept in the boarding house above Cyrus Holloway's general store, counting the priest and the school teacher and the doctor and the 4 nuns who ran the small hospital out of a converted assay office. Most of them did not yet know that the trestle bridge at Ravenmaw Gorge, 11 miles east of town, had been groaning under its own weight for the better part of a year. Most of them did not know that the spring floods had eaten the foundations of the third and fourth pylons. Most of them did not know that the rail company had received 6 separate warnings from its own inspectors and had filed each one in a drawer in Denver. They knew the train came every 14 days. They knew it brought flour and salt pork and tinned beef and coffee and sugar and the mail, and sometimes a new family looking for work in the silver mines. They knew that winter was coming because winter was always coming in Iron Hollow, but they knew the train would keep coming too because the train had always kept coming, and a thing that had always happened was a thing you stopped imagining could ever stop. Tamsin Penrose knew different. She had learned different from her great-grandmother, Morwenna Trevelyan, in a stone cottage on the cliffs of Cornwall when she was 8 years old. Tamsin was 34 that autumn. She was a tall woman, narrow at the shoulders and broad at the hips, with the kind of hands that looked like they had been built specifically for the work they did. Her hair was the color of wet bark, and she wore it pinned tight under a gray scarf because loose hair caught in the steam over the canning pot and burned. Her eyes were a pale, watchful gray, and when she looked at a person, she had the disconcerting habit of looking at them the way a clockmaker looks at a clock that is running slow. She did not look at people often because most of the people in Iron Hollow had decided 4.5 years earlier that Tamsin Penrose was a woman who had gone soft in the head with grief. Her husband Bram had died in the spring of 1887. He had been a carpenter, a quiet, broad-backed man from the same Cornish stock as Tamsin, the kind of husband who built his wife a root cellar 12 feet deep into the hillside because she asked for it and never once made her explain why. He had died of mine fever, the slow drowning sickness that took men in the lower shafts when the ventilation failed, and he had died in their bed with his hand in Tamsin's hand, and his last clear words were, "Keep the little one fed, Tam. Promise me." She had promised. Renly had been 5 years old. The child had not cried at the funeral because she did not yet understand what the word forever meant. Now, 4.5 years later, Tamsin stood on the porch of the small frame house Bram had built on the eastern edge of town, and she watched the last train pull away from the station. Renly stood beside her in a blue wool coat that was getting too short in the sleeves. The dog, a brindled mountain hound named Brindle, that Bram had brought home for the child the winter before he died, sat between them with his tail thumping slow against the porch boards. Mama, Renly said, "Do you think Mr. Marin will bring me a peppermint stick next time?" Like he said, "I think Mr. Marin keeps his promises," Tamsin said, and she did not yet know that this was the cruelest sentence she would say all month. She put her hand on the back of her daughter's neck and felt the warm pulse there, and she thought of the 800 glass jars lined up on the cedar shelves 12 feet under the hillside behind their house. And she thought of the winter that was coming, and she thought of how the town had laughed at her for 5 years. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel afraid. She felt the particular calm of a woman who has been preparing for a storm so long that the first crack of thunder comes almost as a kindness. She had been preparing since the summer of 1885. In Cornwall, when Tamsin was a child, Morwenna Trevelyan had been the woman the village came to when the herring ran thin, or the potato crop failed, or the winter winds blew so long that the salt cod stores ran out before March. Morwenna had a still room built into the side of her cottage where she kept jars of pilchards and oil jars of blackberry preserve, jars of pickled samphire, jars of mutton stewed in its own fat and sealed with mutton tallow against the air. She had a saying she repeated to her great-granddaughter every summer when the two of them stood over the boiling pot together. Every jar is a promise, child, a promise to the winter you have not yet met. Tamsin had carried that sentence across the Atlantic when her family emigrated in 1865, and she had carried it across the plains to Pennsylvania, and she had carried it again across the Mississippi and up into the high silver country of Colorado in the spring of 1885, and she had been speaking it to Renly since the child was old enough to hold a wooden spoon. The people of Iron Hollow did not want to hear about Morwenna Trevelyan. The people of Iron Hollow had a general store. The people of Iron Hollow had a train every 14 days. The people of Iron Hollow had Cyrus Holloway. Cyrus was 48 years old that autumn, a wide, red-faced man with a beard the color of rusted iron and a voice that filled the store whether he meant it to or not. He had come to Iron Hollow in 1879 with a wagon full of dry goods and a talent for the kind of arithmetic that turned other people's needs into his own profits. He had built the store, built the boarding house above it, built a small empire of credit lines that ran through almost every family in town. A woman who put up her own food was a woman who did not need Cyrus Holloway, and Cyrus Holloway took that kind of thing personally. He had stopped selling Tamsin glass jars in the autumn of 1886 after she had bought 300 of them in 8 months. He had announced it from behind his counter on a Saturday afternoon when the store was full of women buying flour and the men were drinking coffee around the stove in the back. "The widow Penrose is filling her own coffin with glass," he had said loud enough for the whole store to hear. 300 jars, 300. I'll give 'em till Christmas before they spoil and poison whoever's fool enough to eat what comes out. The store had laughed. Tamsin had not been there to hear it, but the laughter had reached her by Tuesday, the way every word said in Iron Hollow eventually reached every ear in Iron Hollow. She had ordered the next 200 jars from a wholesaler in Denver and paid $14.70 in shipping, which was more than a month's wages for a hard rock miner. The wagon load had come up the pass in October, and the driver had unloaded it on her porch and said, "Ma'am, I hope you know what you're about because the gentleman at the general store had words for you when I asked directions." "I know what I'm about," Tamsin had said, and she had paid him and given him a jar of preserved peaches for the road. He had eaten it the next day camped at Ravenmaw Pass, and he had said to his horse, "That is the finest peach I have tasted in my life," and he had told no one in Iron Hollow. Idalia Crow had refused a jar of those same peaches in the summer of 1886. Idalia was the wife of Bertram Crow, the superintendent of the Silver Star Mine, and she considered herself the arbiter of what was and was not respectable in Iron Hollow. Her infant daughter had been teething badly and had not slept in 4 nights, and Tamsin, who had buried a husband and was raising a daughter alone, and knew something about sleepless nights, had walked across town with a jar of stewed peaches and offered it as a kindness. Idalia had looked at the jar the way a woman looks at a dead mouse on her threshold. "We don't eat from unmarked jars in this house, Mrs. Penrose," she had said. "One never knows what lurks inside." Tamsin had carried the jar home, and she had not offered another jar to another woman in Iron Hollow for 3 years and 4 months. She had kept filling them. She had kept lining them up on the cedar shelves Bram had built. By the autumn of 1889, the cellar held 804 jars, organized by content, and by year each one labeled in Tamsin's neat hand on a square of brown paper tied at the neck with kitchen string. Tomatoes from the summer of 1886, green beans from 1887, peaches from 1888, venison and elk and rabbit from the hunters who drifted through town in the autumns and traded fresh meat for jars of preserves they could carry into the high country. There were jars of blackberry preserve and rhubarb compote and pickled beets and sauerkraut and mutton stewed in its own fat the way Morwenna had taught her. There were 3 jars of pilchards in oil that Tamsin had made one summer just to prove to herself she still remembered how and which she had told no one about, because there were no pilchards in Colorado and the smell would have given her away. She had done it all in a town that called her mad. If you are listening to this story right now, and you have ever known what it feels like to be quietly dismissed by the people around you for caring about something they have decided does not matter, I want you to stay with me through what comes next. Because what is about to happen in Iron Hollow has happened in 1,000 towns in 1,000 winters. And the lesson Tamsin Penrose is about to teach is the lesson every grandmother in this country once knew and most of us have forgotten. Stay with me. The story turns here. Story turns. The trestle bridge at Ravenmaw Gorge collapsed at 11:47 on the morning of October 21st, 1889, under the weight of an eastbound freight train carrying ore from the Silver Star mine and a single passenger car holding 7 souls, including Aldous Marin. The summer floods had eaten the foundations of the third pylon. The autumn rains had finished what the floods had started. The locomotive and 12 cars plunged 60 meters into the canyon. The fireman, a young man named Calvin Heaps, was found 2 days later on a rock shelf 40 feet below the bridge, his neck broken, his cap still on his head. Aldous Marin was never found. The conductor and 4 of the passengers died at the bottom of the gorge. 2 passengers, a Mormon missionary and his 14-year-old apprentice, survived because they had been standing in the doorway between cars and were thrown clear into a thicket of mountain juniper. They walked 7 miles to a way station and told the telegraph operator, who sent word to Denver, who sent word back to Iron Hollow, that the bridge would not be rebuilt before spring. The gorge was too deep, the timber too far away, the winter already too close. Iron Hollow received the news on the evening of October 22nd. Mayor Thaddeus Ballard read the telegram aloud from the porch of the courthouse, his voice carrying clear in the cold air. People stood in the street and listened. Some of them cried. Most of them stood very still, the way a herd of deer stands still when the wind brings them a smell they cannot identify. Then Mayor Ballard said the second thing, the harder thing. He had spent the afternoon at the general store with Cyrus Holloway, counting the town's reserves. The official storehouse, the one the town council had stocked through the summer as insurance against exactly this kind of disaster, held what the inventory book said should have been 6 weeks of food for 437 people. It did not hold 6 weeks of food, it held 4. Cyrus Holloway had over the previous 3 months quietly sold 40% of those reserves to a Mormon trading caravan that had passed through Iron Hollow in July at 3 times the cost the town had paid for them. He had pocketed the difference. He had falsified the inventory book. He had assumed the way a man assumes when he has been getting away with a thing for years, that nothing would ever happen that would require the reserves to be counted twice. Mayor Ballard told the town this from the porch of the courthouse on the evening of October 22nd, and the silence that followed was the silence of 437 people, understanding all at once that they were going to be hungry for a very long time. Cyrus Holloway was not on the courthouse porch. Cyrus Holloway was in the back room of his store, and what he was doing there was something nobody in Iron Hollow would understand for another 5 months. Tamsin Penrose stood at the back of the crowd with Renly's hand in hers. Brindle sat against her leg. She did not speak. She listened to the mayor finish his accounting, and she watched Idalia Crow across the street put both hands over her mouth, and she watched Reverend Ezra Pickett begin to pray aloud, and she watched the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Hetty Marsh, who had spent 4 years telling other women that the widow Penrose had gone soft in the head, look at the ground and say nothing at all. When the mayor was done, Tamsin walked her daughter home. Brindle walked between them. The stars were very bright that night, the way they only get at high altitude in October, and Renly said, "Mama, are we going to be hungry?" "No, my love," Tamsin said. "Is the town going to be hungry?" Tamsin thought about this for a long moment as they walked. She thought about the herring failure of 1851, when half a Cornish village had eaten potatoes and salt for 3 months, and Morwenna had fed the other half from her still room and asked nothing in return except that they remember. She thought about the jars in her own cellar, 804 of them, glowing in the dark like a promise she had spent 5 years keeping. "Yes," she said, "the town is going to be hungry, and then the town is going to come to us. And we will be ready, Wren. We will be ready." She did not yet know, walking home under those bright stars with her daughter's small hand in hers, that the man who had stolen the town's reserves was not finished. She did not yet know what Cyrus Holloway was doing in the back room of his store that night, or what he had done in Denver in July, or what insurance papers he had signed, and what gambling debts he owed, and what plan he had already set in motion that would in less than 3 months send a hungry mob to her door. She did not yet know that the doctor she most distrusted would become her closest ally, or that the mayor would force her to make a choice no woman should have to make, or that her own 7-year-old daughter would fall sick with a cough that would nearly kill her in January. She knew only this walking home that October night. She knew that she had 800 jars in the ground. She knew that her daughter was warm beside her. She knew that the dog was at her hip. And she knew that the promise she had been taught as a child was about to be kept on a scale her great-grandmother in her cottage by the sea could never have lived to see. The first week of November was strange. People in Iron Hollow walked around their own town the way a person walks through a house they have just learned is haunted, looking at familiar things and seeing them differently. The bakery was still open. The schoolhouse was still open. Children still played in the streets after school, let out sliding on the first thin ice that formed in the wagon ruts. But every adult in town carried the same arithmetic behind their eyes. 4 weeks of food, 5 months of winter. The numbers did not work. No amount of careful chewing could make them work. Mayor Ballard convened the town council on the evening of November 4th and announced a rationing program. Every household would receive a weekly allotment based on the number of mouths under its roof. Hunting parties would go out daily as long as the weather held. Foraging teams would scour the lower meadows for late-season tubers and edible bark. The general store would distribute the rations under the supervision of 2 deputies, because as the mayor put it without quite saying the name, the keeper of those keys had recently demonstrated a failure of moral arithmetic. Cyrus Holloway sat in the front row of that meeting with his hat in his hands and his red beard pressed against his chest. He did not look up when his name was almost said. When the meeting ended, he walked back to his store alone, and he sat at his counter in the dark for 2 hours, and he did not weep. That was a thing he had given up the right to long ago, but he did calculate. He calculated how many days he had before the town truly hated him. He calculated how much longer the insurance papers in Denver could remain valid if his store was still standing in March. He calculated how much food was in the cellars of his neighbors, and how much would have to disappear before a man could justify a fire that would consume a building and collect $5,000 from the Mountain Mutual Insurance Company of Denver, Colorado. He was not in his own mind a wicked man. He was a man who had made bad bets at the gambling tables in Denver and owed $3,400 to a Mr. Amon Reap, who had a reputation for collecting his debts with hammers. And Cyrus had reasoned his way into a position where the only path that did not end with hammers led through a town slowly emptying of its food, and a store eventually consumed by an accidental fire. He had not yet decided when to set the fire. He was waiting for the right moment. He was waiting for the town to be hungry enough that nobody would investigate too closely. He did not know, sitting in his dark store that November night, that the right moment would never come. He did not know that he would be in handcuffs before March. He did not know that the woman he had mocked for 4 years would feed the children he had tried to starve. He thought, sitting there, that he had a plan. He had only a fuse. Tamsin Penrose lived through the first 3 weeks of November the way she had lived through every other week of her widowhood. She rose at 5:30 and lit the stove. She brought Brindle in from the porch and gave him his strip of dried venison. She dressed Renly for school and braided the child's hair and packed her a small tin pail with 2 boiled eggs and a piece of cornbread and a jar of preserved tomatoes that Renly had been told, in the most serious voice her mother had ever used, never to share with the other children and never to mention to anyone. The child understood. Renly Penrose was 7 years old, and she already understood things most adults in Iron Hollow had not yet learned. In the evenings after Renly was in bed, Tamsin went down into the cellar with a lantern, and she inventoried her jars. She had been keeping the same ledger for 5 years. She knew which jars were oldest, which jars should be eaten first, which jars she would not open under any circumstance because they were the seed of next year's promise. She made decisions she had not yet shared with anyone, not even with herself, in plain words. She decided which families she would feed first when the time came. She decided which jars she would never give to Cyrus Holloway, no matter what he offered. She decided that the 3 jars of pilchards in oil from the summer of 1887 would be opened only if Renly got sick because those jars contained more concentrated nutrition than anything else on her shelves, and because Morwenna had taught her that oil-packed fish were the food a Cornish mother gave a Cornish child when the cough came down from the moors. Old Jacob Hennessy died on December 27, 1889 in his small cabin on the southern edge of town. He had been 71 years old, an Irish miner who had come west after the famine and worked the Comstock lode and then the Colorado Silver before his back gave out. He had been one of the few people in Iron Hollow who had quietly traded with Tamsin Penrose through the 4 years of mockery, exchanging strips of jerked venison for jars of preserve because his Irish grandmother in County Kerry had taught him that round things last. When Tamsin found him on the morning of the 28th, he was sitting upright against the wall of his cabin, with his eyes closed and a jar of blackberry preserve unopened on the floor beside him. He had not eaten it. He had been saving it for someone hungrier than himself, and he had died before he could decide who that person was. Tamsin took the jar home. She set it on the cedar shelf in her own cellar. She did not open it for the rest of the winter. She kept it because keeping it was the only way she could find to thank a man who could no longer hear her. 3 nights after Jacob Hennessy was buried, someone tried to break into the cellar. Tamsin woke at 2:15 in the morning to the sound of Brindle's bark, which was not his ordinary bark, but the deep chest sound he made only when something on the property was wrong. She rose without lighting the lamp. She took down Bram's hunting rifle from the pegs over the doorway, and she crossed the kitchen in the dark, and she opened the back door 3 inches, and she listened. Someone was at the cellar door. She could hear the small, careful sound of a crowbar being worked under the iron latch. She did not call out. She stepped onto the porch, and she raised the rifle, and she fired once into the air. The crash of it rolled across the hillside and broke into echoes against the mountains. The figure at the cellar door dropped the crowbar and ran. She could see him by the moonlight on the snow, a heavy shape moving fast for the trees at the back of the lot, and she knew that shape. She knew the way that shape moved. She had seen it behind a counter in a general store for 9 years. She did not chase him. She came back inside and she set the rifle on the kitchen table, and she stood at the window for a long time watching the trees until she was sure he was gone. Renly had not woken. The child slept through the shot the way only a 7-year-old can sleep. Brindle came and pressed his head against Tamsin's hip, and she put her hand on the back of his neck, and she said very quietly, "Good dog, good dog." She did not report it to the sheriff the next morning. She did not have proof. She had a shape in the moonlight and a crowbar at her cellar door and a feeling in her stomach. She did, however, walk into Cyrus Holloway's store that afternoon and buy a half-pound of coffee with cash. And she looked Cyrus directly in the face across the counter, and she said, "Mr. Holloway, I sleep lightly these days. I thought you should know." Cyrus did not answer. He counted out her change with hands that were not quite steady. She walked home through the cold. If you have ever lived in a small town where one man with a fuse can put a whole community at risk, and the only thing standing between him and the harm he means to do is a woman with steady hands and a dog who does not sleep, I want you to stay with me. Because the fire Cyrus Holloway was waiting to set was not the only thing burning in Iron Hollow that January. There was a cough coming down out of the high country, and it was going to find the smallest lungs in town first. The cough came down on January 9th, 1890. Renly had been listless for 2 days. She had pushed away her supper on the night of the 7th and complained that her throat hurt. By the morning of the 9th, she was burning. Tamsin held her hand to the child's forehead and felt the heat coming off her, like a stove door left ajar, and she went down into the cellar, and she took 2 jars off the shelf, and she carried them upstairs and set them on the kitchen table, and she stood looking at them for a long time. One was a jar of pilchards in oil. The other was a jar of stewed venison from the autumn of 1888. The pilchards were the food for the cough. The venison was the food for the doctor. Dr. Linus Whitcomb was a thin, precise man of 51 with steel-rimmed spectacles and a habit of speaking as though every word cost him a small fee he did not want to pay. He had been the town doctor in Iron Hollow for 9 years. He had publicly questioned on at least 3 occasions the safety of home canned food in general and Tamsin Penrose's canning practices in particular. He had used the phrase scientifically dubious and the phrase medically dangerous, and he had in 1887 given a small lecture at the Methodist Church on the dangers of what he called sausage poison, which was the term physicians used in those years for what we now call botulism. He had not been wrong about the existence of the danger. He had been wrong about who could safely manage it. He did not yet know he had been wrong. Tamsin walked to his house on the night of January 9, 1890, at 11:30, carrying the jar of venison in her shawl. The temperature was 23 below zero. Brindle walked beside her. Renly lay on the kitchen table at home, wrapped in 3 quilts, breathing in the shallow, hot way of a child whose lungs are filling. Tamsin had not left her daughter alone with a fever before in her life. She did so that night because she had counted the alternatives, and they had all come up shorter than the one she had chosen. Dr. Whitcomb answered the door in his dressing gown. His housekeeper, a black woman from Tennessee named Mrs. Marcellus Vesper, who had come west after the war, stood behind him with a candle. "Doctor," Tamsin said, "my daughter is burning. I have brought a jar of stewed venison in trade for whatever you have that will bring her fever down and clear her lungs. I know what you have said about my jars. I am asking you to set that aside for the next hour. If you cannot, I will go home and try to keep her alive with what I have. But I am asking." Dr. Whitcomb looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Vesper looked at her for a longer moment. Brindle sat on the doctor's porch with his ears forward. "Mrs. Penrose," Dr. Whitcomb said, "come inside." She came inside. She set the jar on his kitchen table. He looked at the jar the way a man looks at something he has decided in advance to find disappointing. He took up a butter knife and he worked the lid loose. The seal released with the small, soft sigh of a properly canned jar opening after 14 months in a cool, dark cellar. The smell that came up from the venison was the smell of stewed meat with bay leaf and black pepper, and a little thyme, exactly as it had smelled the day Tamsin sealed it. Dr. Whitcomb lowered his face to the jar. He breathed in. He held the breath. He breathed out. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, and his voice had changed, "this venison is 14 months old." "Yes, doctor." "This venison should not be edible." "I know what you have said, doctor. My daughter is dying. Will you trade?" He went to his cabinet. He brought down a bottle of camphor liniment and a bottle of laudanum and a packet of mustard powder for a plaster, and he put them in a wooden box, and he handed the box to Tamsin Penrose. He did not take the jar of venison. He set it carefully on the back of his stove where it would not freeze. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, "I will come with you. I would like to see your daughter." They walked back across town through air so cold it cracked in the lungs, and Dr. Whitcomb brought Renly's fever down with a mustard plaster and a quarter dose of laudanum and a steam tent rigged from a kettle and a sheet, and at 4 in the morning the child slept clean and quiet for the first time in 3 days. Tamsin opened the jar of pilchards in oil, and she fed her daughter 2 small fish on a spoon when the child woke at dawn, and Renly ate them without complaint and asked for more. Dr. Whitcomb sat at the kitchen table with the empty venison jar in his hands, and he turned it over and over in the lamplight. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, "how many of these do you have?" 804, Tamsin said. "I opened 2 tonight." Dr. Whitcomb set the jar down very carefully on the kitchen table. He looked at the woman across from him, the widow who had been the subject of his lectures, the woman whose practices he had called scientifically dubious, the woman whose daughter would have died of pneumonia tonight without the laudanum he had traded for one of her impossible jars. "I have been a foolish man," he said. "You have been a careful man, doctor," Tamsin said. "Carefulness is not foolishness. You did not know what you did not know. Tonight you have learned. If you have ever been wrong about a person in your life, and you have ever had the grace to walk through their door at midnight and admit it, I want you to stay with me. Because what Dr. Linus Whitcomb did at dawn on January 10, 1890, is going to change what happens to Iron Hollow. Stay with me. The story is about to turn again." What Dr. Whitcomb did at dawn was walk to the courthouse and ask to see the mayor. He did not betray Tamsin. He went to the mayor because his conscience as a physician would not let him sit on a kitchen of food while children in the town below were eating bark soup. He told Thaddeus Ballard in the careful, precise way he told everything that the widow Penrose had a cellar full of preserved food, and that he had personally tested a 14-month-old jar of venison and could attest to its safety. He recommended that the mayor approach Mrs. Penrose with a request for charity and an offer of compensation from the town treasury. He did not know that Hetty Marsh was at the courthouse that morning dropping off her husband's lunch pail because her husband worked as a clerk for the town. He did not know that Hetty Marsh was the kind of woman who could hear a whispered conversation through two closed doors. He did not know that by 10 o'clock the news of Tamsin Penrose's cellar would be the only thing anyone in Iron Hollow was talking about. He did not know that Cyrus Holloway would hear it by 11. Cyrus heard it from Hetty's husband, who came into the store at 11:15 to buy his rationed half-pound of beans, and could not stop himself from sharing what his wife had told him. Cyrus listened. Cyrus nodded. Cyrus handed over the beans and watched the clerk walk out of his store, and then Cyrus Holloway sat down behind his counter, and he thought for the first time in 3 months about a path that did not end with hammers in Denver. There was food in this town that was not in his ledger. There was food in this town that, if it could be redistributed under his administration, would buy him a new reputation and possibly a new partnership with the council. There was food in this town that, if he could get to it before the mayor did, could be the basis of an entirely new plan. By 2 in the afternoon, Cyrus Holloway had spoken to 9 men. By 4, he had a story. The widow Penrose, the story went, was sitting on a cellar full of food, while children in Iron Hollow were going to sleep hungry. The widow Penrose, the story went, had been asked for charity and had refused. The widow Penrose, the story went, was hoarding 800 jars and would not share unless paid in silver. None of this was true. Tamsin had not yet been asked. Tamsin had not yet refused. Tamsin was sitting in her own kitchen at that moment, teaching her daughter how to wash and reuse a canning lid for the spring. But the story did not need to be true. The story needed only to spread, and in Iron Hollow that January, every story spread the way fire spreads in dry grass. At 4:30 on the afternoon of January 10th, 1899, men with clubs and one man with a hunting rifle walked east out of town toward the small frame house on the hillside. Cyrus Holloway walked at the front of them. He had told them that they were going to ask Mrs. Penrose very politely to share with the community. He had told them that if she refused, they would have no choice but to take what the community needed. He had told them that any food they brought back would be distributed fairly under his supervision. The men with clubs were not bad men. They were hungry men with hungry children. They had let themselves believe Cyrus's story because believing it was easier than going home to children who were crying. Eulalie Ballard saw them go. Eulalie was 18, the mayor's only daughter, a thin, tall girl with dark hair and her mother's quiet eyes. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse where she taught the youngest children their letters, and she had seen the men gathering at the corner of Main and Birch with their clubs, and she had heard Cyrus Holloway say the name Penrose, and she had turned and run. She ran the long way around through the alley behind the bakery so she would not be seen. She ran in her school shoes through the cold and her lungs burned, and she got to Tamsin's house 6 minutes ahead of the mob. She pounded on the door. Brindle began to bark before she touched the wood. Tamsin opened the door with the bread knife in her hand because she did not yet know who was on the other side. "Mrs. Penrose, men are coming. Mr. Holloway is bringing them. They mean to take your food. My father does not know." Tamsin looked at the girl. Tamsin looked past the girl down the long slope toward town. She could see them now, 10 dark figures moving up the hill, less than 300 yards out. "Eulalie," Tamsin said, "run back through the alley. Find your father. Tell him what you have told me. Run." Eulalie ran. Tamsin closed the door. She crossed the kitchen and took down Bram's old hunting rifle from the pegs over the doorway. She loaded 2 shells. She set the rifle on the kitchen table within reach. She picked up Renly, who was sitting wrapped in a quilt by the stove, and she carried the child to the small back bedroom, and she said, "Ren, stay in here. Whatever you hear, stay in here. Brindle will stay with you." "Mama," Renly said, "what is happening?" "The promise is being kept," Tamsin said. "Stay here." She closed the bedroom door. Brindle did not stay. Brindle followed her back to the kitchen and stood at the front door with his hackles up and a low growl rolling out of his chest like distant thunder. Tamsin did not order him back. She opened the front door and she stepped out onto the porch with the rifle in her hands, and she stood there with the dog at her hip, and she watched 10 men come up the long slope toward her house. The afternoon light was thin and gold. The shadows on the snow were the color of bruises. Cyrus Holloway stopped 20 feet from the porch. The 9 men with him stopped behind him in a ragged half-circle. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, "we have come to ask for the community's share." "Mr. Holloway," Tamsin said, "you have come to take what is not yours to take. The mayor is on his way. I would suggest you all go home." "The mayor is at the courthouse," Cyrus said. "He is not on his way." "He is on his way," Tamsin said, "and the rifle in my hands is loaded, and the dog at my hip has a longer memory than any man here. I will count to 10, Mr. Holloway. Whoever is still on my property at 10 will be removed by whatever means I have available." She did not have to count to 10. At 6, she heard the hoofbeats. Eulalie had not stopped at the courthouse. Eulalie had run to the sheriff's office first because the sheriff's office was closer, and she had told Sheriff Owen Brackett, a 40-year-old man from Ohio, who had been a corporal at Gettysburg, and had not forgotten what a mob looked like, exactly what was happening on the Eastern Hill. Sheriff Brackett had grabbed his deputy and his shotgun and his horse, and he had ridden to the courthouse and lifted the mayor onto the back of the horse and ridden again. They came up the hill at a full gallop. Mayor Ballard was on the back of the horse without a coat. Sheriff Brackett had the shotgun across his saddle. The mob heard them coming and turned. Cyrus Holloway's face went through 3 colors in 2 seconds. Sheriff Brackett pulled up his horse 20 feet from the porch. Mayor Ballard climbed down. He stood in the snow in his shirt sleeves, and he looked at the 9 men with clubs, and he looked at the 1 man with the rifle, and he looked at Cyrus Holloway, and he looked at Tamsin Penrose on her porch with the dog and the rifle and the steady gray eyes. "Gentlemen," Mayor Ballard said, "go home." The 9 men with clubs went home. They went without speaking. They dropped the clubs in the snow as they walked. 2 of them were crying before they reached the bottom of the slope because hunger had brought them to a place they did not recognize, and shame had a colder bite than the January air. Cyrus Holloway did not go home. Cyrus Holloway stood in the snow and he opened his mouth to speak, and then he closed it again because there was nothing he could say that would help him now. "Mr. Holloway," Mayor Ballard said, "you will report to the sheriff's office in the morning. We are going to have a conversation about the inventory ledger." Cyrus walked down the hill alone. Mayor Ballard did not climb the porch immediately. He stood at the foot of the steps in the snow in his shirt sleeves, and he looked up at her, and he said the thing he had not wanted to say. "Mrs. Penrose, I will be honest with you. The sheriff and I cannot stand on your porch every night between now and March. If you will not open the cellar, I cannot promise that what happened today will not happen again with a different crowd on a different afternoon when we are not in time. I am not threatening you. I am telling you what I know. You have a choice to make, and you have to make it tonight, and I would rather you made it on terms than under a fist." Tamsin looked down at the mayor in the snow. She looked at her own daughter's bedroom window. She looked at the dog beside her. She thought for one long cold moment about pouring every jar onto the snow before she let it be taken. And then she thought of Esperanza Cortez's 18-month-old baby, whom she had never met, but whom she had heard 2 Sundays earlier in the church pew, behind her crying the particular cry of a baby who has not eaten enough. She came down off the porch. She set the rifle against the rail. She walked to Mayor Ballard in the snow, and she stood in front of him. "Mr. Mayor," she said, "I will open the cellar, but I will open it on terms. If you cannot meet my terms, I will not open it, and you will not be able to force me, because if you try, I will pour every jar out onto the snow before I let them be taken. Do you understand what I am saying?" "I understand, Mrs. Penrose. My terms are 3. First, every family that takes food from me sends 1 person, man or woman, to learn how to can. Not to take a jar and go home. To learn the work so that next summer, every cellar in this town has its own promise in it. Second, Cyrus Holloway stands in the town square and confesses what he did to the reserves before any jar of mine reaches his hand or his family's mouth. Third, no one but me touches the cellar. I will distribute the food. I will decide the order. Children first, then the old, then everyone else. Do we have an agreement?" Mayor Ballard took off his hat. He held it against his chest in the cold. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, "we have an agreement. If you are listening to this story right now and you have ever been a woman standing on a porch defending what was yours from men who decided your kindness made you weak, I want you to take a breath. The mob is gone. The sheriff is here. The mayor has taken off his hat. The promise is about to begin to be kept on a scale Morwenna in her village by the sea could never have imagined. Stay with me. The cellar is about to open. The cellar opened on the morning of January 12, 1890. Mayor Ballard had spent the previous day going door to door with Sheriff Brackett, telling every household in Iron Hollow what had been agreed and what was required. He had stood Cyrus Holloway in the town square at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and made him confess in front of every adult who could walk to the square exactly what he had done to the reserves and exactly how much silver he had taken from the Mormon caravan and exactly which gambling debts he owed in Denver. Cyrus had stood with his hat in his hands and his red beard pressed against his chest, and he had said the words out loud. He had broken something in himself standing there, and the men who had walked up the hill with him the day before stood in the front row of the crowd, and they did not look at him and he did not look at them, and Iron Hollow understood for the first time what had actually happened to its food. Then the mayor had read out the schedule. Families with children under 12 would come to the Penrose house on the morning of the 12th. The elderly and the sick would come in the afternoon. Everyone else would come on the 13th. Each family would receive jars sufficient to supplement their rations for 2 weeks and would return to the schoolhouse every Thursday evening for canning instruction with Mrs. Penrose. The schoolhouse would be heated. The instruction would begin January 16th. Attendance was required. On the morning of the 12th, the first family came up the hill at 8:30. It was the Cortez family, a young couple from New Mexico, with 3 children, the youngest of whom was 18 months old and had not had a full belly in 2 weeks. The mother, Esperanza Cortez, walked at the front of her family with her infant on her hip. She had been one of the women who had refused to speak to Tamsin at the church social in 1887. She did not look at Tamsin's face when she came onto the porch. She looked at the ground. Tamsin came down the steps. She took the baby from Esperanza's arms. She carried the baby into the kitchen and sat down at the table with the child on her lap. And she opened a jar of pear preserves, and she fed the baby one small soft slice on the tip of her finger, and the baby ate it, and then ate another, and then began to cry the particular cry of a child whose stomach has just remembered what fullness feels like. Esperanza Cortez stood in the doorway of Tamsin's kitchen, and she watched her baby eat, and she put both hands over her mouth, and she sat down on the floor of the doorway, and she wept without sound. "Mrs. Cortez," Tamsin said, "come into the kitchen. Come and eat something yourself. You cannot feed a child if you are starving." Esperanza came into the kitchen. Tamsin gave her a jar of stewed venison and a spoon and told her to eat, and Esperanza Cortez ate stewed venison from a jar in the kitchen of a woman she had refused to speak to 3 years earlier, and she did not stop weeping the whole time. Her husband sat on the porch with the older children and Brindle put his head on the smallest boy's knee and let the boy stroke his ears, and the smallest boy, who had not laughed in a month, laughed once. 41 families came up the hill on the morning of the 12th. Tamsin received each one the same way. She took the youngest child first. She fed it from a jar in her own kitchen. She gave the family a basket of jars sufficient for 2 weeks. She told them when to come for instruction. She did not lecture. She did not gloat. She did not in any of the 41 visits refer to the previous 5 years of her life in Iron Hollow, except once. Idalia Crow came up the hill at 2:30. She came alone. Her husband had refused to come because pride was a thing Bertram Crow could not put down even in a hungry winter. Idalia carried her 3-year-old daughter on her hip. The child was thin and quiet. Idalia stopped at the foot of the porch steps, and she did not climb them. "Mrs. Penrose," she said, "I do not know how to come up these steps." "Mrs. Crow," Tamsin said, "walk up them. The steps do not remember what was said 3 years ago." "I remember," Idalia said. "Then carry it," Tamsin said. "It is yours to carry, but carry it up the steps. Your daughter is hungry." Idalia walked up the steps. Tamsin took the child from her arms. She carried the child into the kitchen. She opened a jar of stewed peaches, the same kind of jar Idalia had refused in the summer of 1887, and she fed the child 2 slices on a spoon, and the child ate them, and the child opened her mouth for a third, and Idalia Crow stood in the kitchen of the widow Penrose, and she watched her daughter eat the very peaches she had once called dangerous. And the only thing she said, the only thing she could find to say, was, "I am sorry, Mrs. Penrose. I am so terribly sorry." "Mrs. Crow," Tamsin said, "come Thursday to the schoolhouse. Bring an apron. We will start with tomatoes." The instruction at the schoolhouse began on the evening of January 16th, and it did not end until the week the supply train returned to Iron Hollow on the afternoon of March 23rd. 11 weeks, 3 sessions every week, an hour and a half each session. Tamsin Penrose taught 146 adults and 42 older children how to pressure can. She taught them the temperature 240 degrees Fahrenheit for the inside of a properly sealed jar, the temperature at which the spores of Clostridium botulinum die. She taught them the pressure 15 pounds for 90 minutes, for meat, less for fruit, more for the high altitude they lived at, because water boils lower in thin air and the canner has to work harder. She taught them how to test a seal, how to read the small dimple in the center of the lid, how to smell a jar when it opened, and trust your nose more than your eyes. She taught them what Morwenna had taught her in another country, in another century, that the only food a person can truly count on is the food that person has put up with her own hands. Dr. Linus Whitcomb attended every session. He sat in the back row with a notebook. He took down every number Tamsin gave. He stopped her once in the third week to ask a question about acidity, and Tamsin answered him in 2 sentences, and Dr. Whitcomb wrote down what she said, and then he said in front of the entire schoolhouse, "Mrs. Penrose, I owe this town a public correction. The lecture I gave at the Methodist Church in 1887 on the dangers of home canning was incomplete. The dangers I described are real. The practices Mrs. Penrose teaches make those dangers manageable. I have been wrong. I will be writing to the editor of the Denver Post before spring to say so in print." The schoolhouse was silent for a long moment. Then a woman in the third row, an old miner's wife named Constance Larkin, who had spent 4 years saying that Tamsin Penrose had gone soft in the head, began to clap. The rest of the schoolhouse joined her. Reverend Ezra Pickett gave a sermon on the last Sunday of January in which he said from his own pulpit, "Christ multiplied loaves and fishes for 5,000 hungry souls on a hillside outside Bethsaida. Tamsin Penrose multiplied jars for 400 hungry souls in Iron Hollow. I called her practice pagan in 1887. I will not call it pagan again. I do not know how to tell the difference anymore between a miracle and a woman with sufficient foresight, and perhaps that is because there is no difference. Perhaps foresight is the only miracle God has ever given us, and we are the ones who keep forgetting where we put it." Silas Brunner, the German mining engineer who had once written a paper for the Colorado School of Mines, arguing that home-preserved meat could not safely exceed 6 months in storage, came to the Penrose house on the morning of February 4th. He brought with him a small-bound notebook and a pencil. He asked Tamsin if he might document her process for an article he intended to submit to the Journal of the Colorado Agricultural College. He spent 4 hours in her kitchen that morning asking questions, writing answers, watching her hands. When he left, he stood in the doorway and he said, "Mrs. Penrose, my mathematics in 1886 were correct. My assumption that no human being could reliably execute the protocol was arrogance. I owe you personally a winter. I will not forget it." Brindle began to slow down in February. He was 8 years old by then, which was middle age for a mountain hound, but the cold of that winter sat heavy on his joints in a way it had not before. He still walked Renly to school every morning. He still slept across the threshold of the bedroom every night, but he no longer ran. Tamsin made him a bed of folded quilts beside the stove, and Renly fed him stewed venison on a tin plate every evening, and Brindle ate slowly and looked up at the child with the soft yellow eyes of a dog who knows he is loved. The supply train returned to Iron Hollow on the afternoon of March 23, 1890. By then, 4 people had died of starvation in Iron Hollow. Old Jacob Hennessy was one. 2 were elderly miners with no family. The 4th was a 23-year-old woman named Henrietta Cuthbert, who had given her rations to her 2 younger brothers through November and December and had not recovered when the cellar opened in January. 4 was a smaller number than the arithmetic of October had predicted. 4 was a smaller number than anyone in the town would ever stop counting. Mayor Ballard read their names from the porch of the courthouse on the morning of March 24th, and the town stood in the street and listened, and no one spoke for a long time after he was done. Cyrus Holloway was in the Denver County Jail by the time the train returned. The federal inspector who arrived with the first supply wagon on March 23rd had been carrying a warrant in his coat pocket. The fire Cyrus had been planning to set in his store had never been set. The insurance company had been alerted by an anonymous letter from Dr. Whitcomb in late January and had refused the policy. The gambling debts in Denver had come due in early February, and Mr. Eamon Reap had sent his men, but Sheriff Brackett had been waiting for them at the train station because Mayor Ballard had wired ahead. Cyrus Holloway would be sentenced in June to 7 years in the territorial prison at Canyon City for fraud and embezzlement. He would die there in 1894 of pneumonia. The store in Iron Hollow would be sold at auction in the autumn of 1890 to a young couple from Pueblo named Adelard and Constance Beaumont, who would stock canning supplies in quantities that would have seemed lunatic the year before, and who would never raise the prices on glass jars, no matter how high the wholesalers raised them on her. The town gathered in the square on the afternoon of April 12, 1890, for what Reverend Pickett had named the Day of the Promise. The snow had melted from the streets. The aspens on the surrounding hills were beginning to show the first thin green at the tips of their branches. Mayor Ballard spoke first from the porch of the courthouse. He spoke for 15 minutes. He said that the town had spent 5 years calling a widow mad, and one winter being fed by her hand, and that the town would not forget which side of pride it had been on. He said that he himself had been one of the people who had laughed in the autumn of 1885, when Tamsin Penrose had first begun ordering glass jars by the gross, and that he had not laughed since the night his daughter Eulalie had run through the alley behind the bakery to warn a woman that the men of his town were coming to take what was hers. He said that he was the mayor of Iron Hollow, and he was 61 years old, and he was learning this winter things he should have learned at 6. Idalia Crow spoke next. She stood on the porch of the courthouse with her 3-year-old daughter on her hip. She said the words, "I am sorry," 11 times in the space of 4 minutes. She did not give a speech. She gave an accounting. She said the name of every kindness she had refused from Tamsin Penrose between 1885 and 1889, and she said what each one would have meant if she had accepted it. When she was done, she did not step down from the porch. She stood there with her daughter on her hip and she waited, and Tamsin Penrose climbed the steps of the courthouse porch, and she took Idalia Crow's hand in her own hand, and the two women stood there together for a long moment without speaking, and the town in the square below understood that something had been put down that would not need to be picked up again. Reverend Pickett spoke. Dr. Whitcomb spoke. Silas Brunner spoke. Esperanza Cortez spoke with her infant daughter in her arms, and she spoke in Spanish for the first half and in English for the second half, and the town listened to both halves with equal attention. Tamsin Penrose spoke last. She climbed the steps to the porch of the courthouse with Renly beside her in a new blue coat. Brindle stayed on the ground at the foot of the steps because he could not climb steps easily anymore. She stood at the rail and she looked out over the square. The square held almost every adult in Iron Hollow. The aspens on the hills behind them were green at the tips. The sky was the high, thin blue of April at altitude. My great-grandmother, she said, fed her village in Cornwall in the herring failure of 1851. She fed 43 families from one still room for 3 months. She is buried now in the churchyard at Mavagisay. She has been dead for 31 years. And she fed this town this winter from her grave because she taught a child who taught a great-granddaughter who taught 146 adults at a schoolhouse in Colorado. She taught me one sentence that I will leave with you today. Every jar is a promise to a winter you have not yet met. I do not want your thanks. I do not want your apologies. I have heard them and I have accepted them, and I will not bring them up again. What I want from you is this. This summer, when the gardens come in and the fruit ripens and the hunters come down from the high country with elk and deer, I want every cellar in this town to be full. I want every family to have its own promise in the ground. I want next winter to find Iron Hollow ready, and the winter after that, and the winter after that, because the railroad will fail again. Not next year, perhaps. Not in 10 years. But it will fail. They always fail. And when it fails, I want this town to feed itself the way my great-grandmother fed her village in 1851, the way I fed this town in 1890. I want you to keep the promise. That is all I ask. That is everything I ask. She stepped down from the porch. Renly took her hand. Brindle stood up stiffly, and the three of them walked through the crowd, and the crowd parted for them, and Tamsin Penrose walked home with her daughter and her dog through the streets of a town that would that summer fill 4,200 jars in its cellars, and would never again for the next 40 years allow itself to depend entirely on a railroad it could not control. If you are listening to this story right now and you have a grandmother somewhere in your memory who knew how to do a thing your generation forgot, I want you to think of her name for a moment. Just her name. Hold it in your mind. The story is almost done. Stay with me for what comes after. What came after lasted 74 years. Tamsin Penrose did not marry quickly. She had told herself in the years after Bram died that she would not marry again, and the winter of 1889 had not changed her mind on the matter so much as it had given her something else to think about. But Dr. Linus Whitcomb came to her house every Sunday afternoon for 4 years to drink coffee and to talk about what he was reading in the new medical journals, and to listen to her talk about the canning instruction she was now giving to women from as far away as Leadville and Aspen who wrote to her asking if they could come and learn. He never proposed. He sat in her kitchen and he drank her coffee, and he watched Renly grow up, and one Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1893 he said, "Mrs. Penrose, I am 55 years old. I have been in love with you since the morning of January 10th, 1890, when I sat at this table with an empty jar of venison in my hands and understood that I had been a foolish man. I am not asking you to marry me. I am telling you so that you know." Tamsin Penrose looked at the doctor across her kitchen table. She thought about Bram, who had been dead now for 6.5 years, and who had told her on his last night with the last clear words he ever spoke that she should keep the little one fed. She thought about Renly, who was now 11 years old, and who liked Dr. Whitcomb, and who had told her mother the previous Christmas that she thought the doctor was a sad man who needed more pie. She thought about Brindle, who was now 11 and who had taken to sleeping under the doctor's chair every Sunday afternoon, and who had never in his life slept under any man's chair but Bram's. "Dr. Whitcomb," she said, "I will think about it." She thought about it for 4 months. She married him on April 18, 1894 in the small church at the south end of town. Renly was 12 years old, and she carried the flowers. Brindle was 12, and he walked Tamsin down the aisle because there was no man in her family to do it, and he walked very slowly and very seriously beside her. And when they reached the front of the church, he sat down at her feet and did not move for the rest of the ceremony. Reverend Pickett married them. Mayor Ballard, who was now 64 and would not run for another term, gave the toast at the reception. Brindle died on the morning of September 4th, 1898, on the porch of the house Tamsin had moved into with Dr. Whitcomb, which was on the eastern hill not far from her old house, which she had kept and rented to the new schoolteacher. Brindle was 16, which was a very long life for a mountain hound, longer than any dog he had ever known. He died in the sunlight with his head on Renly's lap. Renly was 16 years old by then, and she was crying quietly the whole time. They buried him under the small spruce at the south corner of the property, and Dr. Whitcomb carved a piece of pine into a small marker and burned the words into it with a heated nail. Brindle, guardian of the promise. The marker was still there when the property was sold in 1968. The current owners, a retired couple from Boulder, replaced it with a small bronze plaque that says the same thing. Renly Penrose Whitcomb grew up to teach canning the way her mother taught canning, which was the way Morwenna had taught it to the women of her own village in the lean summer of 1851. She started teaching when she was 19 in 1901 in the schoolhouse at Iron Hollow. By 1910, she was traveling to small towns throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, giving 3-day workshops at granges and church basements and community halls. By 1920, she had taught more than 2,000 women. By 1942, when the United States entered the Second World War, and the federal government began encouraging American families to plant victory gardens and preserve their harvests against wartime shortages, Renly Whitcomb Cortez, who had married Esperanza Cortez's eldest son Mateo in 1907, was 60 years old and was hired by the Colorado Extension Service to design the canning curriculum that would be taught in every county in the state. She designed it. She trained the trainers. She lived to see victory gardens fill the cellars of Colorado in 1943 and 1944, and she sat in her kitchen in Pueblo on VE Day in 1945, and she opened a jar of blackberry preserve her mother had put up in 1918, and she ate it with her grandchildren, and she told them again the story of the winter of 1889. Renly died in 1964 at the age of 82. She is buried in Pueblo beside Mateo Cortez. Her granddaughter Ren Beaumont, named for her, taught home economics in Denver until 1991, and still at the age of 93, as of this recording, gives demonstrations at the Colorado State Fair every August. Tamsin Whitcomb née Penrose died on the afternoon of October 14, 1921, at the age of 66. She died in the kitchen of the house on the Eastern Hill in the middle of putting up a batch of tomatoes from her garden. She had felt unwell that morning and had refused to go to bed because she had said the tomatoes would not wait. Dr. Whitcomb, who was 83 by then, and still her husband and still in love with her, found her sitting in her chair by the stove with the lid of the canning kettle in her hand and a small smile on her face. The doctor sat down on the floor of the kitchen beside her chair, and he held her hand for a long time, and then he stood up and he finished putting up the tomatoes himself because Tamsin would have wanted the batch finished. There were 71 jars in the final batch of her life. The family opened them one at a time over the next 13 years. The last one was opened in the winter of 1934, in the depths of the Great Depression by Renly and Mateo Cortez and their 4 grandchildren in a small house in Pueblo, where 4 children went to bed fed because a woman in Iron Hollow had put up a jar of tomatoes in October of 1921, and her family had been keeping it for the right moment, and the right moment had come. The root cellar Bram Penrose dug into the hillside in the summer of 1886 still stands. It is owned and maintained by the Iron Hollow Historical Society. The original cedar shelves are still there, though the 800 jars are long gone. The Society has stocked the shelves with replica jars made by a glassblower in Leadville, lit by a small electric bulb installed in 1972, and they glow in the dim light on summer afternoons when the tourists come, the way the original jars must have glowed in the lantern light on the morning of January 12, 1890, when the first family came up the hill. Above the cellar door, carved into the heavy pine lintel, is an inscription Tamsin herself added in the spring of 1891. The carving is shallow now. The wood has weathered for 135 years, but the words are still legible to anyone who stops to look. Every jar is a promise kept. In the autumn of 1978, food scientists at Colorado State University, working with the Iron Hollow Historical Society, excavated a small cache of unopened jars that had been sealed in a wall of the original cellar in 1889 and forgotten. They tested 12 of them. 8 of the 12 still met United States Department of Agriculture safety standards 89 years after they had been sealed. The principles Tamsin Penrose had learned at her great-grandmother's elbow in Mévagissé in 1863, 240 degrees, Fahrenheit, 15 pounds of pressure. Hermetic, seal, cool, dark storage are the same principles taught today by the National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia. The science was always there. Tamsin Penrose was simply ahead of the institutions that would later claim it. The last train left Iron Hollow on October 16, 1889. The promise Tamsin Penrose made in glass that summer is still being kept every autumn in every cellar in America, where someone remembers that abundance is borrowed, and only the prepared get to keep it. If you have listened to this whole story, I want to ask you one final thing. What is the skill your grandmother knew that your generation has almost forgotten? Tell us in the comments. Tell us her name. Tell us where she came from and what she could do with her hands. Because there are children listening to these stories who will one day need to know what we have not yet taught them. And the only way the promise stays kept is if we tell each other again and again where it came from. Thank you for listening to the story of Tamsin Penrose and the winter of 1889 in Iron Hollow, Colorado. If this story moved you, please subscribe, and we will tell you another one next week. May your cellar be full. May your jars be sealed. May the winter you have not yet met find you ready.